Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 74 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, third Canto, and we're up to chapter 26. We've finished the first section. We're going on to the second and last section right now. The chapter is titled Fundamental Principles of Material Nature. Right, so here we go. First of all, let's chant our prayers. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachade Chatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchkalptarubhyas Cha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So we did the first section yesterday, the whole thing. Now the second section is titled Devahuti asks about and Kapila explains the characteristics of the Supreme Person. So there's two themes, Devahuti questioning, Kapila explaining, but we've merged them together. And that section goes from verse 9 to verse 72, which is the end of the chapter. So let's read through the verses. Verse 9, Devahuti said, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, kindly explain the characteristics of the Supreme Person and his energies. For both of these are the causes of this manifest and unmanifest creation. So verse 10, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the unmanifested eternal combination of the three modes is the cause of the manifest state and is called pradhan. It is called prakriti when in the manifested stage of existence. Anyway, it's a little complicated, but we'll explain in due course. Verse 11, the aggregate elements, namely the 5 gross elements, the 5 subtle elements, the 4 internal senses, the 5 senses for gathering knowledge, and the 5 outward organs of action are known as the pradhan. 12. There are 5 gross elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether. There are also 5 subtle elements, smell, taste, color, touch, and sound. 13. The senses for acquiring knowledge and the organs for action, number 10, namely the auditory sense, sense of taste, the tactile sense, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the active organ for speaking, the active organs for working, and those for traveling, generating, and evacuating. Verse 14, the internal, subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects in the shape of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. 15. All these are considered the qualified Brahman. The mixing element, which is known as time, is counted as the 25th element. 16. The influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is felt in the time factor, which causes fear of death due to the false ego of the deluded soul who has contacted material nature. 17. My dear mother, O daughter of Swayambhuva Manu, the time factor, as I've explained, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom the creation begins as a result of the agitation of the neutral, unmanifested matter. Verse 18. By exhibiting his potencies, the Supreme Personality of Godhead adjusts all these different elements, keeping himself within as the Supersoul and without as time. Verse 19. After the Supreme Personality of Godhead impregnates material nature with his internal potency, material nature delivers the sum total of the cosmic intelligence, which is known as Hiranmaya. This takes place in material nature when she is agitated by the destinations of the conditioned souls. Verse 20. Thus, after manifesting variegatedness, the effulgent Mahatattva, which contains all the universes within itself, which is the root of all cosmic manifestations, and which is not destroyed at the time of annihilation, swallows the darkness that covered the effulgence at the time of dissolution. 21. The mode of goodness, which is the clear, sober status of understanding the personality of Godhead, and which is generally called Vasudeva or consciousness, becomes manifest in the Mahatattva. Verse 22. After the manifestation of the Mahatattva, these features appear simultaneously. As water in its natural state, before coming in contact with earth, is clear, sweet, and unruffled, so the characteristic traits of pure consciousness are complete serenity, clarity, and freedom from distraction. Verses 23 and 24. The material ego springs up from the Mahatattva, which evolved from the Lord's own energy. The material ego is endowed predominantly with active power of three kinds: good, passionate, and ignorant. It is from these three types of material ego that the mind, the senses of perception, the organs of action, and the gross elements evolve. Verse 25. The threefold ahankara, the source of the gross elements, the senses and the mind, is identical with them because it's their cause. It is known by the name of Sankarshan, who is directly Lord Ananta with 1,000 heads. 26. This false ego is characterized as the doer, as an instrument, and as an effect. It is further characterized as serene, active, or dull, according to how it is influenced by the modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. 27. From the false ego of goodness, another transformation takes place. From this evolves the mind, whose thoughts and reflections give rise to desire. 28. The mind of the living entity is known by the name of Lord Aniruddha, the supreme ruler of the senses. He possesses a bluish-black form resembling a lotus flower growing in the autumn. He is found slowly by the yogis. 29. By transformation of the false ego in passion, intelligence takes birth, O virtuous lady. The functions of intelligence are to help in ascertaining the nature of objects when they come into view, and to help the senses. 30. Doubt, misapprehension, correct apprehension, memory and sleep, as determined by their different functions, are said to be the distinct characteristics of intelligence. 31. Egoism in the mode of passion produces two kinds of senses: the senses for acquiring knowledge and the senses of action. The senses of action depend on the vital energy, and the senses for acquiring knowledge depend on intelligence. Verse 32. When egoism and ignorance is agitated by the sex energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the subtle element sound is manifested, and from sound come the ethereal sky and the sense of hearing. 33. Persons who are learned and who have true knowledge define sound as that which conveys the idea of an object, indicates the presence of a speaker screened from our view, and constitutes the subtle form of ether. Verse 34. The activities and characteristics of the ethereal element can be observed as accommodation for the room for the external and internal existences of all living entities, namely the field of activities of the vital air, the senses, and the mind. 35. From ethereal existence, which evolves from sound, the next transformation takes place under the impulse of time, and thus the subtle element touch, and thence the air and sense of touch become prominent. 36. Softness and hardness, and cold and heat are the distinguishing attributes of touch, which is characterized as the subtle form of air. 37. The action of the air is exhibited in movements, mixing, allowing approach to the objects of sound and other sense perceptions, and providing for the proper functioning of all other senses. Verse 38. By interactions of the air and the sensations of touch, one receives different forms according to destiny. By evolution of such forms, there is fire, and the eye sees different forms in color. 39. My dear mother, the characteristics of form are understood by dimension, quality, and individuality. The form of fire is repeated by its effulgence. Verse 40. Fire is appreciated by its light and by its ability to cook, to digest, to destroy cold, to evaporate, and to give rise to hunger, thirst, eating, and drinking. Verse 41, by the interaction of fire and the visual sense, the subtle element taste evolves under a superior arrangement. From taste, water is produced, and the tongue, which perceives taste, is also manifested. 42. Although originally one, taste becomes manifold as astringent, sweet, bitter, pungent, sour, and salty due to contact with other substances. Verse 43. The characteristics of water are exhibited by its moistening other substances, coagulating various mixtures, causing satisfaction, maintaining life, softening things, driving away heat, incessantly supplying itself to reservoirs of water, and refreshing by slaking thirst. 44. Due to the interaction of water with the taste perception, the subtle element odor evolves under superior arrangement. Thence the earth and the olfactory sense, by which we can variously experience the aroma of the earth, become manifest. 45. Odor, although one, becomes many, as mixed, offensive, fragrant, mild, strong, acidic, and so on, according to the proportions of associated substances. 46. The characteristics of the functions of earth can be perceived by modeling forms of the Supreme Brahman, by constructing places of residence, by preparing pots to contain water, etc. In other words, the earth is the place of sustenance for all elements. 47. The sense whose object of perception is sound is called the auditory sense, and that whose object of perception is touch is called the tactile sense. 48. The sense whose object of perception is form, the distinctive characteristic of fire, is the sense of sight. The sense whose object of perception is taste, the distinctive characteristic of water, is known as the sense of taste. Finally, the sense whose object of perception is odor, the distinctive characteristic of earth, is called the sense of smell. 49. Since the cause exists in its effect as well, that's good, isn't it? Since the cause exists in its effect as well, the characteristics of the former are observed in the latter. Yes, that is why the peculiarities of all the elements exist in the earth alone. Verse 50. When all these elements are unmixed, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the origin of creation, along with time, work, and the qualities of the modes of material nature, entered into the universe with the total material energy in 7 divisions. 51. From these 7 principles, roused into activity and united by the presence of the Lord, an unintelligent egg arose, from which appeared the celebrated cosmic being. Well, that's pretty interesting. 52. The universal egg, or the universe in the shape of an egg, is called the manifestation of material energy. Its layers of water, air, fire, sky, ego, and Mahatattva increase in thickness one after another. Each layer is 10 times bigger than the previous one, and the final outside layer is covered by pradhan. Within this egg is the universal form of Lord Hari, of whose body the 14 planetary systems are parts. Verse 53, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Virat Purusha, situated himself in that golden egg, which was lying on the water, and he divided it into many departments. So, verse 54. First of all, a mouth appeared in him, and then came forth the organ of speech, and with it the god of fire, the deity who presides over that organ. Then a pair of nostrils appeared, and in them appeared the olfactory sense, as well as prana, the vital air. 55. In the wake of the olfactory sense came the wind god, who presides over that sense. Thereafter a pair of eyes appeared in the universal form, and in them the sense of sight. In the wake of this sense came the sun god, who presides over it. Next there appeared in him a pair of ears, and in them the auditory sense, and in its wake the Dig-Devatas, or the deities who preside over the directions. Verse 56. Then the universal form of the Lord, the Virat Purusha, manifested his skin, and thereupon the hair, mustache, and beard appeared. After this all the herbs and drugs became manifested. And then his genitals also appeared. 57. After this, semen, the faculty of procreation, and the god who presides over the waters appeared. Next appeared an anus, and then the organs of defecation, and thereupon the god of death, who is feared throughout the universe. Verse 58. Thereafter the two hands of the universal form of the Lord became manifested, and with them the power of grasping and dropping things. And after that, Lord Indra appeared. Next the legs became manifested, and with them the process of movement, and after that Lord Vishnu appeared. 59. The veins of the universal body became manifested, and thereafter the red corpuscles, or blood. In their wake came the rivers, the deities presiding over the veins, and then appeared an abdomen. Verse 60. Next grew feelings of hunger and thirst, and in their wake came the manifestation of the oceans. Then a heart became manifest, and in the wake of the heart, the mind appeared. Verse 61. After the mind, the moon appeared. Intelligence appeared next, and after intelligence, Lord Brahma appeared. Then the false ego appeared, and then Lord Shiva, and after the appearance of Lord Shiva came consciousness and the deity presiding over consciousness. 62. When the demigods and presiding deities of the various senses were thus manifested, they wanted to wake their origin of appearance, but upon failing to do so, they entered the body of the Virat Purusha one after another in order to wake him. Verse 63. The god of fire entered his mouth with the organ of speech, but the Virat Purusha could not be aroused. Then the god of wind entered his nostrils with the sense of smell, but still the Virat Purusha refused to be awakened. 64. The sun god entered the eyes of the Virat Purusha with the sense of sight, but still the Virat Purusha did not get up. Similarly, the predominating deities of the directions entered through his ears with the sense of hearing, but still he did not get up. 65. The predominating deities of the skin, herbs and seasoning plants entered the skin of the Virat Purusha with the hair of the body, but the cosmic being refused to get up even then. The god predominating over water entered his organ of generation with the faculty of procreation. But the Virat Purusha still would not rise. 66. The god of death entered his anus with the organ of defecation, but the Virat Purusha could not be spurred to activity. The god Indra entered the hands with their power of grasping and dropping things, but the Virat Purusha would not get up even then. Verse 67, Lord Vishnu entered his feet with the faculty of locomotion, but the Virat Purusha refused to stand up even then. The rivers entered his blood vessels with the blood and the power of circulation, but still the cosmic being could not be made to rise. 68. The ocean entered his abdomen with hunger and thirst, but the cosmic being refused to rise even then. The moon god entered his heart with the mind, but the cosmic being would not be aroused. 69. Brahma also entered his heart with intelligence, but even then the cosmic being could not be prevailed upon to get up. Lord Rudra also entered his heart with the ego, but even then the cosmic being did not stir. 70. However, when the inner controller, the deity presiding over consciousness, entered the heart with reason, at that very moment the cosmic being arose from the causal waters. How's that? So the cosmic being is getting up now. When the inner controller, the deity presiding over consciousness, entered the heart with reason, at that very moment the cosmic being arose from the causal waters. Verse 71. When a man is sleeping, all his material assets, namely the vital energy, the senses for recording knowledge, the senses for working, the mind and the intelligence, cannot arouse him. He can be aroused only when the supersoul helps him. Interesting. Verse 72. Therefore, through devotion, detachment, and advancement in spiritual knowledge acquired through concentrated devotional service, one should contemplate that supersoul as present in this very body, although simultaneously apart from it. Phew, that's quite a bit, isn't it? Okay, so we're going back now. Yeah, here we are. Second section, verse 9 to verse 72. We just read all the verses. So the title is Devahuti asks about and Kapila explains the characteristics of the Supreme Person. Okay, so verse 9. Devahuti said, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, kindly explain the characteristics of the Supreme Person and his energies, for both of these are the causes of this manifest and unmanifest creation. So yeah, there's a fairly solid purport here. Prabhupada begins by pointing out that Prakriti, or the material nature, is connected with both the Supreme Lord and the living entities. Yeah, that's us, the living entities. Just as a woman is connected with her husband as a wife and with her children as a mother. So in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord explains that he impregnates Mother Nature with children, the living entities, and thereafter all the different species become manifest. So the relationship of all the living entities with material nature has been explained. It's already been explained. Now, the relationship of the material nature with the Lord is sought by Devahuti. She's looking for that. So the unmanifest material world is Mahatattva, and from Mahatattva, material manifestation has emerged. And then, second paragraph, there are 4. It's quite a major purport. So the Vedic literatures say that it was by the glance of the Lord that the material energy is impregnated, and then everything is born of material nature. So Bhagavad Gita, 9th chapter, also confirms this. Adyakshena, under his direction and by his will, nature's working. So nature doesn't work blindly. After understanding the position of the conditioned souls in relation to material nature, Devahuti wants to know how nature is working under the direction of the Lord, and what is the relationship between material nature and the Lord. In other words, she wants to learn the characteristics of the Lord in relation to the material nature. So we go on to paragraph 3. So the relationship of the living entities with matter and the Lord with matter are not on the same level, although the Mayavadis may interpret in that way. So when it said that the living entities are bewildered, the Mayavadi philosophers say that the living entities are part of the Lord. So the Mayavadis say, when the living entities are bewildered, the Lord is bewildered, but he's never bewildered. That's the difference between the personalists and the impersonalists. So fortunately, Devahuti was intelligent enough to understand that the living entities are not on the level of the Supreme Lord. So anyway, the difference between the Lord and the conditioned souls is that the Lord is the Lord, the master of material nature, and not subject to its control. He is controlled by neither spiritual or material natures, the Lord. He's the supreme controller and cannot be compared to ordinary living entities who are controlled by material nature. So, on we go to the 4th paragraph. And yes, this is important. The two words, Sat and Asat, are important. The cosmic manifestation, this material world, is Asat, doesn't exist. But material energy is Sat, or ever existing. So anyway, the material nature is ever existing, and in its subtle form is the energy of the Lord. But it sometimes manifests this non-existent or temporarily existent cosmos. So Srila Prabhupada gives us an analogy to help us understand. The father and mother both exist, but sometimes the mother begets children. So similarly, this cosmic manifestation, which comes from unmanifest material nature of the Lord, so the manifestation sometimes appears and then sometimes disappears. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, but the material nature is ever existing, and the Lord is the supreme cause for both the subtle and gross manifestations of this material world. Verse 10, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the unmanifested eternal combination of the three modes is the cause of the manifest state and is called pradhan. It is called prakriti when in the manifested stage of existence. Okay, so let's have a look at the purport here. So the Lord is pointing out that material nature in its subtle stage is called pradhan. Then he analyzes that pradhan. So the explanation of pradhan and prakriti is that pradhan is the subtle, undifferentiated sum total of all material elements. Although they're undifferentiated, one can understand that the total material elements are contained here. So then when the total material elements are manifested, how? By the interaction of the three modes, then the manifestation is called prakriti. So the impersonalists say Brahman is without variegatedness and differentiation. And, one could try to say that pradhan is the Brahman stage. But actually it's not. It's not. The pradhan is distinct from Brahman, because in Brahman there are no modes. So one can argue that Mahatattva is also different from pradhan, because in Mahatattva there are manifestations. So the actual explanation of pradhan is given here. When the cause and effect are not clearly manifested, avyakta, the reaction of total elements doesn't happen. So that stage of material nature is called pradhan. So pradhan is not the time element, because in the time element there are actions and reactions, there's creation and annihilation. Nor is it the jiva, or the marginal potency, the designated conditioned living entities, that's us devotees. So pradhan is not the time element, because in time there are actions and reactions, and there's creation and annihilation. So nor is pradhan the jiva, or the marginal potency, the designated conditioned living entities, because the designations are not eternal. So an adjective, Prabhupada says, used in this connection is nitya, which indicates eternality. Therefore, the condition of material nature immediately previous to its manifestation is called pradhan, Srila Prabhupada says. Verse 11, the aggregate elements, namely the 5 gross elements, the 5 subtle elements, the 4 internal senses, the 5 senses for gathering knowledge, and the 5 outward organs of action are known as the pradhan. So Prabhupada makes the point in the purport that according to Bhagavad Gita, the sum total of the 24 elements described herein is called the Yonir Mahadbrahma. And that the sum total of living entities are impregnated into this Yonir Mahadbrahma. Then they're born in different forms, beginning with Brahma down to the ant. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, in the Srimad Bhagavatam and other Vedic literatures, the sum total of the 24 elements, pradhan, is also described as Yonir Mahadbrahma. It is the source of the birth and subsistence of all living entities. So, verse 12. There are 5 gross elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether. There are also 5 subtle elements, smell, taste, color, touch, and sound. 13. The senses for acquiring knowledge and the organs for action, number 10, namely the auditory sensation, the sense of taste, the the tactile sense, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the active organ for speaking, the active organs for working, and those for traveling, generating, and evacuating. 14. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having four aspects in the shape of the mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. The distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. So, right, this is verse 14. Let's have a look here. So Prabhupada makes the point that the four internal senses or subtle senses described herein are defined by different characteristics. When pure consciousness is polluted by material contamination, and when identification with the body becomes prominent, one is said to be situated under false ego. So consciousness, we read, is a function of the soul. Therefore, behind the consciousness is soul. Consciousness is polluted by material contamination called ahankara. Verse 15. All these are considered the qualified Brahman. The mixing element, which is known as time, is counted as the 25th element. So, interesting point. According to the Vedic version, and Prabhupada quotes just a little bit from Chandogya Upanishad 3.14.1, so according to that version, there's no existence beyond Brahman. And of course it's stated also in the Vishnu Purana that whatever we see is Parasya Brahmana Shakti. So the point is, when Brahman is mixed with when Brahman is mixed with the modes, the three qualities, goodness, passion, and ignorance, then it's called, it's sometimes called Sagun Brahman, which consists of these 25 elements. In Nirguna Brahman, where there's no material contamination, or in spiritual likely, the modes are not present. So where there's Nirguna Brahman, unalloyed goodness prevails, and Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, Saguna Brahman is described by the Sankhya system of philosophy as consisting of 25 elements, including the time factor, past, present, and future. Verse 16, the influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is felt in the time factor, which causes fear of death due to the false ego of the deluded soul who has contacted material nature. Okay, so let's get into it. There's a couple of paragraphs. So the living entity's fear of death is due to the false ego of identifying with the body. Otherwise, there's no death for the soul. But fear of death arises because of a person being absorbed in identifying the body as the self. Srimad Bhagavatam is cited 11.237, Bhayam Dvitiya Benaveshata Syat. Dvitiya refers to matter, which is beyond spirit. Matter is a secondary manifestation of spirit. For matter is produced from spirit. Just as material elements are caused by the Lord, the body is also the product of spirit soul. So the body is called Dvitiya, the second. Yeah. One who's absorbed in the second is afraid of death. But once we're convinced that we're not the body, then there's no question of fearing death, as the soul doesn't die and can't die. Second paragraph. If the soul engages in devotional service, then he becomes free from birth and death. Then his position is complete spiritual freedom from the body. The fear of death is the action of Kala. So in other words, time is destructive. Anything created is subject to destruction. That's the action of time. So therefore time is a representation of the Lord. And of course that's there in Bhagavad Gita. And the Lord, and it reminds us that we must surrender to the Lord. So Lord Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that if someone surrenders to him, no longer any problem of birth and death. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, we should therefore accept the time factor as the Supreme Personality of Godhead standing before us. Verse 17, my dear mother, O daughter of Swayambhuva Manu, the time factor, as I've explained, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom the creation begins as a result of the agitation of the neutral, unmanifested matter. Okay, so here, the unmanifested state of material nature, the pradhan, is being explained. And the Lord says that when the pradhan is agitated by the glance of the Lord, it begins to manifest itself in different ways. Before this, it was in a neutral state. There's no interaction of the modes. In other words, material nature can't produce any variety of manifestations without contact with the Lord. The Lord is the cause of products of material nature, and without contact with him, material nature can't produce anything. Okay, so we go on to the second paragraph. So Prabhupada explains, Chaitanya Charitamrita gives the example of the nipples, or so-called nipples, on a goat's neck. They're sort of fleshy little things coming out from the neck, bottom of the neck of the goat. So those so-called nipples under the neck, they don't give milk. It's similarly, the material nature appears to the material scientist to act and react wonderfully, but it can't act without the agitator, which is time. And time is the representation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So when time agitates the neutral stage of material nature, then material nature begins to produce varieties of manifestations. So then ultimately, it's the Lord who's the cause of creation. Yes. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, as a woman cannot produce children unless impregnated by a man, material nature cannot produce or manifest anything unless it's impregnated by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. in the form of the time factor. So on to verse 18. On to verse 18. By exhibiting his potencies, the Supreme Personality of Godhead adjusts all these different elements, keeping himself within as the Supersoul and without as time. Well, yes, certainly. There's talk of the Supersoul within the heart. The Supreme Lord is there as the Supersoul. So this situation, this is explained in Bhagavad Gita with the example of the two birds flying into the tree. They're sitting in the same tree. One is just witnessing the Upadrashta and the Anumanta. The Upadrashta is the witness, and Anumanta, Bhagavad Gita 13:23, is the Anumanta is the sanctioning authority. So the conditioned soul engages in happiness and distress of the body given to him by the external energy of the Lord. But the super soul Paramatma is different from the conditioned soul. He's sitting beside the soul just to sanction his activities. Of course, the conditioned souls, we know, they come to the material world just to lord it over. But since one cannot do anything without the sanction of the Supreme Lord, so he lives with the Jiva soul as the witness and sanction giver. He's also Bhokta. He gives maintenance and sustenance to the conditioned soul. So we go on to the second paragraph. Since we're constitutionally part and parcel of the Lord, he's very affectionate towards us. Unfortunately, when we're illusioned, we forget our relationship with him. But as soon as we remember, we're liberated. So our minute independence is exhibited by our marginal position. If we like, we can forget the Lord and come to the material world to lord it over. But if we like, we can turn to service to the Lord. So we have that independence. Yeah. Turn away from the Lord. So we have that independence, but still the Lord is so kind. He always remains with us. His concern for us is neither to enjoy or to suffer the material body. He just remains as the sanction giver and the witness, as we were saying. So that, in order that, he can see that we get the results of our activities. And then there's a very short third paragraph, purport of verse 18. Outside our bodies, the Lord remains as the time factor. So according to the Sankhya system, actually coming from Lord Kapila, there are 25 elements. The 24 already described, plus the time factor, that's 25. And Prabhupada makes the point, according to some learned philosophers, the Supersoul is included to make a total of 26 elements. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.